Thanks for coming out to today's talk with authors at Google. I stumbled across a documentary called Crime After Crime on Netflix one night, and I was really quickly sucked into this movie. I was really surprised by it. And it's a heart-wrenching story about a woman named Debbie Piegler. And without getting into the gory details, because I'm not a lawyer, Debbie was convicted of the murder of her abusive boyfriend and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. But under a new law that was passed in the state of California that allows cases involving battered women to be reconsidered, two lawyers took on the task of getting Debbie out of prison. Joshua Safran and his colleague Nadia got to work setting her free. And they hit basically every conceivable obstacle you can imagine. And what was supposed to be, from what I understand, a relatively short case, which I think means somewhere in the 6-month range, ended up taking 8 years of pro bono work. And they could have quit at any point. They have families and wives and all of these things that make you not want to do pro bono work. But their unwavering dedication and commitment for justice drove them through the better part of a decade of this work. And it's exactly these qualities that made me reach out to Joshua in a complete shot-in-the-dark email, and that, to my surprise, worked out. So Crime After Crime screened on the Oprah Winfrey Network and in theaters nationwide. The film was an official selection of the 2011 Sundance Film Festival, has won 25 awards. And more recently, he's authored his memoir, Free Spirit, Growing Up on the Road and Off the Grid. Hitchhiking for years around the American West with his Wiccan welfare mother in the 80s, Safran didn't attend school until 6th grade, living in buses, utopian communes, on a tree stump, and even in an ice cream truck. Eventually, his mother married an abusive, alcoholic, ex-American guerrilla fighter who made Safran's life unbearable. So Joshua shared his story with NPR, BBC, CBS, and Fox, and he's been around the Bay Area quite a bit, and he's here to share his story with us today. So without further ado, here's Joshua Safran.
Thank you. Thank you.
This is mine.
And thank you to Brian. Can you hear me in the back? All right, am I? Okay. So thank you to Brian. I think it's a testament, strangely, of the power of the internet that I was at home one evening, and somewhere out in the ether, this movie was living in the land of Netflix, and suddenly I got this email, and here we are today. And I really want to thank Brian for reaching out. One of the big questions that came up as part of my advocacy work on behalf of Deborah Piegler, this battered woman who was serving life in prison, is why you? Why this sort of large, white, hairy man representing this African-American woman from South Central LA who had been convicted of killing her batterer, and why did you stick with the case for so long? And I used to give a lot of false reasons, which made me seem better and cooler than I really was, like, because in the pursuit of justice we cannot pause for anything, we have to move forward, and because I'm dedicated, and some of the reasons were truer than others, including the fact that Debbie is and was an incredibly charismatic person and really made you want to advocate for her when you met her. But there was a deeper reason, and it was one that I wasn't really willing to talk about. But Debbie's case and representing her was an important transformative experience for me. And I'll step back for a moment and just say I'm happy to be back on the West Coast. I've been traveling on a book tour. I've been on the East Coast and was surprised to find that people still keep up with the Joneses, 1950s style. So it's like everyone has to have the latest car and the bigger house and move to the fancier neighborhood. And I was trying to, and in Miami, get the latest cosmetic surgery, which was very strange for me. And I was trying to explain to someone at the Miami Book Fair, one of my hosts, how it's different out in the Bay Area. And she said, well, how do you kind of keep up with the Joneses in the Bay Area? And I said, well, like if you had been the first one to sell pot to the Symbionese Liberation Army, or if you learned how to brew tea from a forgotten tribe in Myanmar, that would give you street cred. That would give you bragging rights. That's really what we value. And I say that because my wife for many years, my wife Leah, who's here, for many years, really had a lot of street cred in Berkeley because she grew up in and out of a hot tub in Big Sur, California. Her yard at her home was littered with clay sculptures of female genitalia. In fact, the first time I went to her home and met her parents, I tripped over something and I looked down and said, "Is that a giant clitoris?" And Leia's mother said, "Oh, good for you, great." So Leia knew, though, that she had met the right person when she met me, because she said, "You're the first person I've ever met who has a better childhood than I did. You've really got the street cred," for all of the reasons that Brian mentioned, including living in an ice cream truck. And Leia for years said, "You got to write your story. Who else had these experiences? It's so strange. We all sort of know about the 1960s and all these countercultural rainbow warriors who went off and lived in these communes, but we don't hear about the aftermath of all that, sort of the dark side of the age of Aquarius, what happened to their children." And I was interested in telling this story and writing about it, but I couldn't for a number of reasons, including the fact that the second half of my childhood were a series of incredibly embarrassing and humiliating experiences that I had that I didn't want anyone to know about. So with that, I decided not to become a writer, but to become a lawyer. It was sort of my attainment of the American dream. When I was 25 years old, I graduated from UC Berkeley School of Law, and I got an unbelievable offer to work at a large corporate law firm where I met my friend Renee, who's here today. We had offices from London to Tokyo, and I felt like I was really someone. I had arrived. We had these beautiful white carpets, and if you spilled something on the carpet, like a guy would literally run out of a closet and clean it up in front of you and disappear again. And I had my own corner office with a name plaque on it with my name. And on the first day, my secretary came and said, "I don't mind. I'm happy to do your dry cleaning for you if you'd like." And I sort of nodded. And in my mind, I was like, I know dry cleaning has something to do with laundry, and I don't think I own anything dry cleanable. But I was like, "Oh, yeah, thank you very much." And as I listened to the resumes and biographies of the people around me, I felt very out of place. My previous work experience had been as a janitor to work my way through college, and then before that, driving large combines harvesting peas in rural Washington State, where I had ended up. So I was sort of trying to fit in and trying to do well. And about 6 months in, I began to feel a certain hollowness, a certain emptiness in the work that I was doing, as I was fighting, one Fortune 500 company on behalf of another over $20 million that neither of them really needed. And when an opportunity to represent a battered woman serving life in prison for killing her batterer came up, I sort of leapt at the opportunity without consciously knowing why. That's a project that I want to be involved in. And one of the strange things about prisons in California, they're almost as hard to get into as they are to get out of. So it took me like 5 months to get security clearance, to get into the prison, to finally meet this client. And I was a little naive, sort of a young lawyer, and I kind of sat down with her and I was like, "Okay, your job is to talk, and I'm going to tell your story and get you out of here, and together we'll do this, and you got to be really candid with me and trust me, I'm your lawyer." And this woman Debbie looked at me and she said, "So you basically want me to tell you all of the most humiliating, horrible things that have ever happened to me in my entire life so that you can make them a public document?" And it's like, "Yeah, that's the plan, And not surprisingly, she had a hard time disclosing to me and telling me about the experiences that she had had until almost a year went by, and I still felt like she wasn't really being truthful. She wasn't sort of remembering a lot of things that I assumed that she really did remember. And finally she said, "Look, you're a man, and a lot of the things that happened to me, all of these horrible things that happened to me, happened at the hands of a man, and it's hard for me to just sort of tell you these things." And I said, "Well, can you tell me something that was maybe funny or ironic or strange, something that's not as humiliating to you?" And the memory that she chose was an important one. She said, "When he was done whipping me, he would get raw steaks and put them on my welts to bring down the swelling. And it was funny because it was dead flesh, it was dead meat, but it was giving me new life. And also, he was the batterer, but he was also the healer, and it was strange that way." And the memory of the raw meat was a real trigger for me, and I broke right through the attorney-client relationship, and I said, "Oh, I forgot about the meat." And for me, it was funny because we were vegetarians. To kill and eat an animal was murder. You would never, ever eat an animal. But it was somehow okay for my stepfather to beat the hell out of my mother, and we had meat on hand to bring down the swelling on her cheekbone, on her face, so she could be presentable. And Debbie, my client, kind of looked at me like, "You're not my lawyer, you're like me. What's going on here?" And she began asking me all these questions. And the next thing I knew, she was sort of taking my statement, if you will. And I had this strange realization that I had never talked about the experiences I had had as a kid, not even with my mother, with whom I experienced them all. And my first therapy moment was in a maximum security prison for women where my therapist was a convicted killer and sort of in the shadow of the sniper tower through the razor wire. And that was my first moment of talking about the experiences that I'd had in this second half of my childhood. And Debbie, after that, said, I felt in that day that we were like a couple of war veterans and that we were rolling up our sleeves to compare our scars, both figurative and literal, and that's when I trusted you. So I sort of stumbled into doing the right thing. Subsequently, I talked to seasoned criminal defense attorneys who were like, huge mistake, you never befriend your client, that was totally unprofessional, what were you thinking? But it turned out to be an important mistake because at that point, Debbie was sort of willing to disclose to me, and we really talked with one another. And at that point, once I had sort of the courage to talk about this story, I began to feel like, well, maybe I could write about these things and tie that into my advocacy. And I came to this realization that the reason, in one way, that I was really doing this case was to prove to my 10-year-old self that I was finally strong enough and courageous enough to stand up for someone who was being battered, even though it was many years later. And shortly thereafter, we began to have media inquiries. We had raised a lot of attention with Debbie's case. We ended up disqualifying all 1,000 attorneys of the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office for conflicts of interest, which was a really big story. And we got a call from the San Francisco Chronicle who said, well, we want to do a profile on the lawyers, you and your partner. And I said, no, I don't want to do that, because I knew that the question was going to be, well, what motivated you to take this case? And I didn't want to go into that. And a couple weeks later, I told that to Debbie as we were doing an update, and she said, well, why don't you want to do the story? You should do the story, it'd be great. And I was like, no, it should really be about the client, not the lawyer. And she was like, are you afraid to talk about your life and what happened in your life? And I said, no, I'm not afraid, it's just, And Debbie was a very perceptive person. She said, all the things you told me, it wasn't my fault, I had nothing to be ashamed of, and more importantly, we're breaking these taboos and the wall of silence and talking about domestic violence, and you're the perfect case, because your mother was this militant feminist, someone who was on the avant-garde of the women's movement, and yet she became a victim of domestic violence. So you have to tell your story. And I still wasn't quite ready, and then she did the truly nuclear option in the Bay Area, and she said, a lot of people think that domestic violence only happens to poor black women in South Central LA. And at that point I was like, all right, okay, I'll do it. And I did this interview, and the night before the Chronicle article ran, I was sort of in this law firm, and I was looking at these beautiful white carpets and thinking, tomorrow morning I'm basically just going to smear mud on all of them, because here I am, this sort of lawyer, this professional, and I'm going to be telling stories about being a 10-year-old crying at my own powerlessness at not defending my mother, and her head being swollen up to the size of a melon, and how am I going to face these people? And I came in the next morning, and there was some awkwardness. One of the male partners who I worked with for years sort of looked at me like, this guy's damaged goods. I thought I knew you, and now I don't know you. But the overwhelming response that I got from the people that I worked with was, good for you, you're courageous, thank you for telling your story. And even some of the women attorneys who I worked with who came and spoke to me and said, something like similar happened in my case, in my life. And so that was a very kind of empowering experience. And then this movie Crime After Crime showed, as Brian said, at the Sundance Film Festival, and it has me talking a little bit about my experiences, and all these offers came, oh, come speak to our domestic violence group, come speak to this high school, come speak here. So I began speaking about it, but again, sort of as an attorney, not as a survivor myself. And then I ended up doing a spoken word piece talking about this raw meat interaction that Debbie and I had, and this overwhelming sense of shame and humiliation at not stepping in to defend my mother, and for the worst reason, the reason being that I was too afraid for my own safety, that I was going to be killed. Which intellectually I can look back and say, well, I was only 10, what was I really going to do? But when you're 10, you're not thinking that way, and your brain develops around the idea that you're a coward and that you're not doing the right thing. And so I did a spoken word piece about that, and this guy came up to me in LA afterwards. He's about 45 years old, totally ripped, tattooed, and he comes up and he's like, hearing you speak, I know that I'm in an abusive relationship. And I'm looking at this guy like, who is abusing this man? He looks like a cage fighter. It's, how can it be? And as he's telling me his story, I begin to understand more. He says, I never hit the kids, and I have a son, and I didn't even think that he knew what was happening, but she gets me so jealous, she gets me so angry I can't control myself, and I don't want my son to have to end up like you talking about this someday. So I'm going to go back to my 12-step program, and I know I can't really control it anymore, so I know that now. And I sort of had this moment of, okay, well, somehow I just affected this guy's life, so I'm going to start to talk about my story. So my story begins, I was born into a coven of witches in a commune in the Haight-Ashbury in 1975. And when I say the coven of witches line on the East Coast, people are usually like, what are you talking about, witches? In San Francisco, people are like, do you know Dave? Because I know that he grew up in the... so I'll just throw that out there. Witches, not the Halloween variety of witches, but rather my mother was part of a group of women who were reclaiming religion from the patriarchy. They felt that sort of men and male domination had derailed religion over the course of many millennia, and they were sort of taking it back. So my first memories as a little boy was sort of, someday I'll grow up and I'll have a womb and I'll bear a child, and that'll be like the best thing that I can do. And they finally broke the news, like, look, little man, you'll never be able to have a baby. And then my mother at a certain point felt, witchcraft is too organized of a religion. And she said, I can be tripping my brains out, but it still feels like church. This is too organized. In 1980, I was coming of age to go to school, and my mother felt very strongly that school was no place for children. That was literally something that she said, school is no place for kids. It teaches capitalism and competition and violence, and this isn't the future that I want for my young warlock. She was going to train me to be a warlock and a revolutionary leader. She felt for sure that the Vietnam War was going to cause an overthrow of the U.S. government, and she was going to be a leader in that movement. And when that didn't happen, she knew that it was only a matter of time until I would be drafted, because I was a boy, and sent off to die for the next lie that the man was going to force upon the American people. So she wanted to take to the hills and raise me to use my third eye, the one that society didn't want me to know about, to use my clairvoyance and psychic powers. And when the revolution happened again, we would descend from the hills and I would be a leader. And so I like to analogize us to being, I don't know if you've seen the movie Terminator 2 with Sarah Connor, knowing that there are these robots from the future, except in our version of it, there actually were no robots from the future. Sarah Connor really was just sort of off a little bit. And that was sort of the way that we grew up, that I grew up, wandering from place to place, different communes, the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh people in Oregon, sort of back to the land, white Native Americans in Idaho who made their own buckskin clothing, all the while without running water, without electricity, toilets, refrigeration. And the one commonality that I noticed with all these various intentional communities was whatever their purported philosophy was, there always was sort of a strong man who rose up to be sort of the leader and eventually took on a concubine. And it was sort of right about the concubine time that it got weird and we left. And we seemed to hit all these communes right at concubine time. So we were moving from place to place. And throughout it, I was brought up to never to call my mother mom or mother. I called her Claudia. It would have been sexist and reductionist to call her mom, because she was much more than a mother. She was a full human being with a full range of identity and human expression, and to just bootstrap her into that one little identity would have been wrong. So I called her Claudia throughout. I grew up learning about herstory, not history, because history, again, is sexist, and really spotting all of the sexism and racism and all of the things that my mother trained me to see. And when we would be in these small towns in rural Oregon or Washington or Idaho, someone would be like, what team are you rooting for? And my mother's stock answer was, whatever team has the larger population of urban poor, because domestic violence rates go down when the home team wins. That was sort of her philosophy about. So she was very attuned to all of these issues. However, when I was 9, she began doing Central America amnesty work. And she believed that the U.S. backed death squads in Central America, U.S. foreign policy in Central America was the new Vietnam. It was only a matter of time until it was going to escalate into a full war. And she was doing this asylum work, getting refugees from Central America fleeing these foreign wars that we had caused, and getting them to, getting them health care and a place to stay and that kind of thing, while we were living on a cabin on a mountain, and sort of half-built cabin on the side of a mountain. And she met a man who was 10 years younger than she was, who was sort of her ideal man. He was kind of a Che Guevara figure, a fighter, a guerrilla commander from El Salvador, but also an intellectual, a poet, a shaman, a healer. And when she met him, the spirits actually said to her, husband. And he was somebody pretty special. And she met this guy. He told her his story. He was crying as he told her his son had been shot down in a crossfire in San Salvador. That turns out to have been a lie, but at the time it was very real. And my mother was sort of captivated by his story because he had been tortured by these death squads and had survived and escaped. And he had lost his family in defending the poor and helpless in El Salvador. So she was really taken in by him. He was also a very muscular, physically powerfully built guy who would tell her things like, sometimes when I'm talking to you, I feel like all of the suffering that I went through in my life was to get me to you, so I can meet you, this most beautiful woman that I've ever met. And of course, she ended up taking him to her bed, and he was a very sensitive guy, and he cried a lot. But over time, because he had PTSD and various trauma that he'd experienced, he had nightmares and flashbacks, and he would sometimes lash out at her, slapping her, a black eye here and there, shoving her, strange rages. But this was all part of the trauma that he'd experienced. And after all, we were Americans, and as Americans, weren't we somewhat responsible for U.S. foreign policy? And we were in some way responsible for the things that had happened to him. So my mother was trying to do chakra readings on him and healing with him, counseling with him to make him better. And he, of course, turned to drink because alcohol was a way of sort of masking some of the trauma that he'd experienced. And one of his favorite things to do, besides kind of lashing out at my mother at that point, was to fight with cops. He would go into town and he would get in these fights when he was drunk with police officers, in part because he always wanted to know who the real man was. And with a cop, no one got to prove one way or another because the cops would sort of cheat, in his words, by pulling out a gun and like arresting him instead of being real men and fighting him. So on one of these occasions, he was arrested, and they let him out when we made bail, thanks to a generous gift from my grandmother. And they revealed to us, his public defender reveals to us that they're going to initiate deportation proceedings and send him back to El Salvador. He was in the country illegally. And he reveals to us that the second his foot hits that tarmac at Cuscatlan Airport in San Salvador, he'll be drilled through the back of the head by the death squads and die right there. So my mother is faced with the decision, does she want the man that she loves to have a death sentence passed on him, which is what deportation would be, or does she want to try to help him? So of course she wants to help him, and the only way that she can think of to help him is to marry him, because by marrying him, that's a path to citizenship. So the night before the wedding, my soon-to-be stepfather gets into the box of wine that we have and just beats the hell out of my mother with closed fists in front of me. And the next morning, there's no question, the wedding will not be canceled, but it will be postponed to allow my mother's face time to become more recognizable. So 10 days later, they're married. My mother, who had never worn makeup in her life because it's sexist for a woman to wear makeup, is coated in makeup to cover up her black eye and the swellings that she still has. And this man, Leopoldo is his name, becomes my stepfather. And I talk more about this in Free Spirit, but the next sort of 4 years of our lives are spent surviving and ultimately overcoming Leopoldo. As part of this, I decide I got to go to school. School is a place for kids, and perhaps more importantly, school is a way of getting away from this guy, at least for part of the day. So at that point, we sort of are finding ourselves physically more isolated than we've ever been before. We're living on one of the San Juan Islands on the floor, sleeping on the forest floor of a temperate rainforest. And my mother and stepfather have salvaged old wooden pallets from behind a dumpster at Thrifty Foods, and we're sleeping on the forest floor on these pallets. I emerge for my first day of 6th grade, very excited to go to school, covered in tree sap and pine needles, wearing old thrift store clothing that my mother has patched with blue paisley fabric here and there. And as you can imagine, I started to get onto the bus like, woo, I'm going to school. And the kids are like, we're going to kick this guy's ass. So I'm this total freak. I get that. I walk out of the wall of forest. So I'm being brutalized by the kids, having a terrible time. And there must have been a riot in the teacher's lounge when I show up, because I don't understand the dynamics of a classroom, that you have to raise your hand to be called upon, that you can't just sort of blurt out answers or talk about, feminist theory, critiquing what the teacher has to say. And at the same time, while I have like an adult reading abilities, I know can talk about Russian literature and world history, I don't have any knowledge of mathematics. I don't know what a fraction is. I don't know how to do multiplication. I can't read or write in cursive or longhand, which is a really big deal to them. So they didn't know whether to put me in remedial classes or regular or gifted classes. And one of the teachers finally steps up and she says, look, I will tutor you after school. You just stay after school. I'll tutor you. I can see that you're bright. I'll help you catch up. And I say, well, I can't stay after school. I got to get back on that bus that goes over the bridge to the island and lets me off in front of the forest where we're staying. And she says, well, your mom can come and pick you up after late. And I said, well, I can't. We had a car, but my stepfather crashed the car into a stump, and now we don't have a car. And she says, well, we'll call your mom. We'll figure this out. Well, we don't have a phone or running water, electricity, house, etc. And she says, well, where are you living? And I said, well, my stepfather is chopping down trees. He's trying to build a pyramid. He believes in the ancient occult magic of Egypt, and he's building us a wooden pyramid that will channel this energy, and it'll be like a healing place for us to live. Needless to say, the pyramid doesn't happen. In fact, we are squatting on some land supposedly owned by the family of a man named Crazy John, who, as his name would imply, is pretty crazy. My stepfather, in a drunken rage, threatens to kill Crazy John and his pregnant girlfriend. We're forced to flee the land, and we live for a short time in town, which is the first time with running water and electricity in a long time. And in town, not only do I get to go to after school and be tutored because it's walking distance, but I have access to a public library. And so the library becomes my home. I'm like the biggest champion of public libraries and the little kindnesses along the way. And that started me on the path that led me to you today. And I think we'll have some time. I want to show you a short video. It's about 3 minutes long that sort of is like a trailer for the book and my story, and also have some time for Q&A. But the one takeaway that I want to say is one of the things that got me through, that kept my faith in sort of human decency, were all those little kindnesses, the teachers and the other people along the way who sort of gave me a smile sometimes or offered to help. And also one of the takeaways that I gained from Debbie, my client. When I was first representing her, she would ask me a lot of questions about criminal law, and I would say, I don't know the answers to any of these questions because I don't do criminal law. I'm like a corporate lawyer. And she finally said, well, it's okay. I can't fire you. There's no one else. And then I laughed because that was funny. There was no one else. But over time, it began to be sort of a real motivator because there was no one else. If we abandoned Debbie, if we didn't keep up with her case, there was no one who was going to step forward and help her. And even though I wasn't an expert in this area of law, nor was my partner, the one thing, as Brian can attest, is we just kind of persevered and stuck with it. So I want to give that blessing to all of you and say that whatever it is that you're passionate about in your lives, whether it's the work that you do here or things that you do outside, whether it has to do with domestic violence or something else entirely, that if you just take that realization that if you're waiting for some expert or some industry guru to come in and help you in that issue, they'll never come. You'll be waiting forever. There's just you. There's no one else. So just kind of engage and persevere. And if you stick with it long enough, you'll be successful in the way that we were in getting Debbie out. So we'll show you this 3-minute movie, and we'll do a Q&A.
Chosen one.
No, I'm the hungry one.
The hungry one? What you want to eat, what?
A donut.
A donut?
I was only 6 years old, but I already wanted more than a donut. I wanted to be normal, to live the American dream. Instead, I got whatever this is. All because my mother wanted to find some place called Utopia.
Can I go to bed now?
We hit the open road in 1980.
When are we gonna get somewhere?
Utopia could be right around the corner, Joshie. Use your third eye, and we'll get there faster.
We hitchhiked for 5 years. My mother was looking for a place to call home.
Here! This could be our home. Oh, I got it! This is our home.
I was looking for a father.
Hey! A donut.
Sir!
Why is he calling you sir?
Because he respects me.
And it's perfectly good.
One of these men actually cared about me.
Good move, Josh.
But my mother chose this guy.
He's a freedom fighter. He's gonna make an amazing father to you, Joshy.
He was the worst decision she ever made.
You to be a man, right? Like me? What's here? Hunter! Don't lie to me! You lying to me! What you going to do, huh?
Wait! Take me with you!
Sir, are you his father or legal guardian?
No, but
Sir, you're gonna have to come with me.
Josh! Tony!
You scared?
Gun's supposed to protect you.
That's all you got!
So we made that movie with the producer and director of Crime After Crime. We got together to sort of make this 3-minute trailer with a mostly volunteer cast and crew of about 100 over 6 days in the Bay Area.
2 questions. One, why did the trial take so long? And 2, is the book both about your journey and the trial, or more about your upbringing?
So the first question on the trial, we thought it would be, as Brian said, we thought it would be relatively straightforward. There was a new law passed in 2002 that allowed women who'd been convicted before California sort of recognized what was then called a battered woman's defense. There were all these women that were serving life in prison who never got to present that defense. So it was like, well, if you can get a lawyer, the lawyer can present it. So it took us a couple years to sort of just establish the evidence that we needed to show that she had been battered conclusively. And we knew at that time that the LA DA was really aggressively opposing the release of all these women. Unlike basically every other county in California, Steve Cooley was his name, the LA DA had a real opposition to these releases. So we ended up getting 12 precipient witness statements, declarations from all kinds of people, including neighbors and friends of the batterer, et cetera. So we felt like we had a pretty solid case. That was about 2 years in. We went to LA, we actually met with Steve Cooley, the LA DA himself, and got a plea deal that she would get out for time served because of all this new evidence. And not only did we have it on a handshake, we had it in writing. And we unfortunately ran into what can only be described as office politics, believe it or not. So the woman who was the head of the appellate division, who was nominally in charge of these kinds of cases, had never been consulted because we sort of accidentally went to the top guy, the elected DA. And she apparently threw what was called sort of a political firestorm and was yelling and screaming and throwing things in the DA's office. And they got back to us and said, well, we're not honoring that. We are hereby withdrawing the offer that you've already accepted, and we will oppose you. And at that point we said, well, that's unlawful and we'll sue you. And they said, okay, do your best. So it ended up dragging on because we had to sue them. And of course the legal process the judicial process is very slow. And then there were a number of twists and turns in the case, including revelations that not only was Debbie sort of legally innocent since she had this battered woman's defense, but she was actually factually innocent, didn't do the killing herself, didn't engineer the killing. In fact, the DA's only witness that established that it was a paid police informant who perjured himself on the stand. The DA's office knew about it. So it sort of snowballed into this bigger and bigger case until finally a judge held that they were circling the wagons to protect their professional reputations. So the case really for them became about covering up misdeeds because their own people were going to be fired or worse if the truth came out in this case. So that was sort of why the case ended up taking so long, and it was sort of a lead case in this battered women's law in California, and looked to in various other states as to the entire criminal justice system. How can this happen? How is this going to work, et cetera? So that was sort of that answer. The book is really more just my childhood story, basically from 0 to 12, and then I have a chapter where I sort of tie it into the work on that case. And I think it wasn't really until I wrote the book that I really realized some of, or much of my motivation, really, at least in taking the case, but also in sticking with it, is that, again, this strange feeling of powerlessness, and somehow this case, in a very real way, allowed me to sort of prove to myself, at least, that, oh yeah, I can do something, I can do what's right. And as I thought about it, I thought, you know, what I really wanted when I graduated from law school and as I was becoming a man, you know, was a time machine. You know, I just wanted, for whenever you have these kind of experiences in your life, you kind of want to go back in time and help yourself or help, you know, someone. And since I didn't have time traveling capability, maybe Google will develop that. But at the time, that wasn't available to me. So I thought, well, the next best thing is I can become a lawyer and sort of find people who are similarly situated and help them. And that will kind of metaphorically fix what I went through.
So what part does religion play in your life?
It's a great question. Religion played a very important role for me. As you heard, I was sort of brought up with stargazers and constellation worshipers and pagans. But more than anything, I was brought up with nothing. Even at the most remote areas of the counterculture beyond the perimeter, people still celebrated Christmas. I mean, you could be like an Indian guru somewhere up in Oregon, but you still had like a Christmas tree and an Easter egg hunt and all of that. My mother didn't have any of that, so we had absolutely nothing. And unlike everyone else who was sort of from somewhere, my mother didn't know where we were from, and I at one point talked to my grandmother, her mother, said, "Where are we from?" My grandmother said, "Who knew?" And I was like, well, surely you must know where the family came from. Who knew? They kept changing the borders. So there's sort of this sense of like, we're from nowhere, we don't believe in anything. And I had a sort of a very innate spiritual sense. I went through a lot of life or death kind of experiences and really did feel at times that I was being shepherded by some otherworldly force, but I had no vocabulary for it. So when I was 9, my mother and I were living on the side of this mountain, and we passed a cabin down the trail. And this guy who was, I don't know exactly what he did, but he lived in Seattle, sort of his vacation home. When he wanted to get away from it all, he came and lived by our, main house where we lived. And my mother started talking to him, and he said, "Where are you from?" And my mother said, "Oh, we're from San Francisco." And he goes, "Oh, ain't no Landsman from the Bay Area. Yeah, no Jews from San Francisco." And my mother laughed, said, "How'd you know we were Jewish?" And he said, "Well, look at your kid, he's got a rabbi's nose." And they started talking and laughing, and finally he ended his little soliloquy, and he said, "So I must have been the only Italian kid in Brooklyn with not 1 but 2 bar mitzvahs." And my mother thought this was hilarious, and we left. And it was a strange moment for me where all of a sudden there was some history. This guy knew things about us and strange places and things beyond, east of the Mississippi. And so when we got out into the sort of darkening mist, I asked my mother, what are we again? That guy knew about us and my nose and something. My mother, "Oh yeah, we're Jews." And what does that mean? Well, like Freud, Einstein, Marx, Jews. So I was sort of thought about that, and I was like we're related to them, like, sort of, But then she gave a good Jewish answer. She said, "Well, we should go to the library and look it up." So when I finally got into town and went to the library, I really went in sort of with no sense of what I was looking for, and kind of came away with this Encyclopedia Britannica introduction, which was, oh, we're descended from like this ancient tribe that wrote the Bible and introduced the world to God, and it's supposed to shine like a beacon of righteousness. But the thing that really touched me about the Jewish story that I read in this library was that it mimicked my own life, sort of this nomadic wandering from place to place, sort of perpetually demeaned and discriminated against by various people, yet still kind of thriving and living by your wits. And that really resonated with me. So I think that was sort of my introduction. And then as part of that, I went and talked to my mother, who then told me that she had given up a child for adoption when she was a teenager. She'd briefly dated a Colombian Marxist revolutionary and had given up this baby for adoption. And somewhere in New Jersey, I had a half-brother. And somehow in my mind, that was sort of that he was probably living a Jewish life because it was New Jersey after all, and everyone in New Jersey must be Jewish. And so I had this sense that somewhere out there were my people. I didn't know who or where they were, and someday he would sort of clasp me by the arm and pull me up out of this smashing and screaming and take me home, So that became part of my own mythology. And then spiritually, a couple years later, my mother had dated a Rastafarian Mennonite, which, to give the picture, no mustache, but sort of chin beard and dreadlocks. And he made this mixtape of reggae music for me. And so my mother was obsessed with Coltrane and Miles Davis and this amazing jazz, which was very traumatic for me to listen to. But reggae really appealed to me. It had this kind of melodic, spiritual sound to it. And we were around the campfire, and I was singing this Bob Marley song, "The stone that the builder refused shall be the head cornerstone." And I didn't know what a head cornerstone was, but I knew that I had been the stone that the builder refused, and that spoke to me. And so I'm singing this song, and my mother says, "Oh, that's from Psalms." And I was like, "No, this isn't some weird Bible thing. This is like Bob Marley, like roots, truth, thing." And my mother, "No." She had this book, which I called the Tanakh, which was the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. But so she gave me this book, and I'm looking through, and I find the book of Psalms, and I end up reading the whole thing to just disprove her, because at that point in my life, I'd rejected everything that she was about. I thought, yes, you can hug a child with nuclear arms. Like, everything that she believed in was wrong. So I started working my way through the book of Psalms to disprove her. Found out that she was right. That was a line from Psalms. But also read Psalms is the poetry of King David, sort of a young man in the wilderness crying out for help. And as I read that book, I was like, this is like my experience. I'm really resonating with this. So that really became a spiritual path for me as well, and it provided the vocabulary for the things that I was feeling, in a sense of belonging and a sense of identity. And at a certain point, my mother said, "You're basically going to be subscribing to a rule-based patriarchal religion." And I thought about it. I was like, well, I had no rules and no father, so that sounds about right. So that was sort of that part of my path began there.
I have read the first two chapters of your book. You are an amazing writer.
Thank you.
So do you have other plans to write more books?
I do. I am working on a book proposal for the sequel right now. So you'll see when you get to the end of the book, it kind of ends at 12 with us running into this commune by the Canadian border in a school bus. And so it sort of connects that kid to being arrested a few times and kind of being unsure whether I was going to make it out, to sort of making it out. Thank you. I appreciate that.
You talk a little bit about why you became a lawyer, and it seems very disconnected with what you ended up doing as your primary source of income as a lawyer. Mm-hmm. I am also a corporate lawyer, so take that with a grain of salt. But how did you become a corporate lawyer, and were you ever able to find more fulfillment in that than the Fortune 500 battle of 20 million?
Yeah. I guess, so I had sort of twin aspirations in going to law school. Part of it was, I still to this day am actually offended by lawyer jokes, because I still have at least a perception in my mind that most lawyers are these guardians of justice doing great work. How could you make that joke, But, and I'm sad that that's probably not true. But, so I did have this sense, both in my own personal life, as far as criminal defense attorneys who played an important role in my life to keeping me out of jail, for example. I had a great respect for lawyers, and I really saw them as sort of these uniquely capable people, because they had the monopoly of knowledge on how to navigate the system, and yet were down dealing with people like us who were outside of that system. So they were kind of these warriors, really. So that was sort of on the one side. And the other side is, when you grow up with no running water or electricity and everything else, or sugar or television, that's all you want, you can guarantee that your child will rebel. So for me, as I was sort of looking around, I was like, okay, who are successful people? And I have this lawyer thing, and oh yeah, lawyers do well. That's like a big deal. That's like a respectable thing. So that was sort of my motivation. And then when I got to law school, I had this amazing, awful moment, which you may have experienced, where you're like, I'm going to do justice. And you're like, wow, you have to live in like a trailer and eat canned beans to do like the nonprofit work. But these people will pay you like over, 6 figures to just like do whatever that's awesome. So, and for me, I was truly excited about that opportunity. And to be totally clear, I loved it. I still, to this day, take like 10-minute showers. And I just love having everything. I gained a ton of weight because I could eat donuts, and, it was great. I blame everything on my childhood. But no, so I was enjoying all of that, and I loved all that got me. But at the same time, I think the hours expectations in these big corporate firms were such that they don't want you to do anything but be a corporate lawyer. And so I think that was really I still have great respect for people who can integrate pro bono work into their corporate practice. I think that's righteous. For me, I ended up, sadly, when people say, how did this movie must have been so great for your career? I'm like, it destroyed my partnership prospects and I got fired, but that's sort of what happened. I was at the firm, I was up for partner, and they said, look, dude, you do way too much pro bono, you need to be, kicking up your hours, and it's great that you're representing this woman, but enough already, it's been like 8 years, So at that point I left and still was working on her case actually, and then I was lucky enough that my current day job, the Port of Oakland called, and I had been representing them as outside counsel. They said, come in-house. And I was like, well, I'll need all these days off for my parole hearings. And they're like, what are you talking about? You're like the aviation, land use, all these areas of expertise I'd cultivated. And I explained it to the person who was, I thought, about not to give me a job. And much credit to my boss, who then said, that sounds really righteous, this case that you're working on. I'll make a deal with you. And I was like, okay, what's this deal going to be? He's like, when you get her out, you bring her up here and we'll have like a lunch for her. And I was like, all right, good deal. So I'm now a government lawyer, so it sort of has worked out. Well, the one other thing that I'll say, just because I know that maybe, my mother, this very interesting character, but also a very interesting person. We sort of grew up together. When I went to college, my mother went to college. When I got a job, she got a job. I had years of resentment and sort of anger to her for sort of what I began to perceive as the unnecessary deprivation that we had to go through. In a way, I can almost forgive her for the domestic violence years, because I sort of understood the dynamic of how we'd gotten in there and how we got out, but sort of all the other stuff, the deprivation. And then I got to college and I'm meeting all these kids who grew up in cul-de-sacs in suburbs, eating sugar, watching television, having hot showers, all the rest of it. And I get to college and they're like, this sucks, I don't want to be here, this is lame, and my mother never loved me, and my father likes my brother more, and they never had any domestic violence or anything else, but they were totally bummed out. And I'm in college thinking like, this is the greatest experience of my life. I can just go to the dining hall, and there's just as much food as you want. It's like Google. You can take these showers, you can watch television, you can do anything. I was just like, this is amazing, I was loving it. And so part of me was like, well, there's different ways of judging a parent, but I always felt like my mother loved me. I always felt like she was like, you can do anything you want to do, you can be anyone you want to be. She may not have supervised me, she may not, but she loved me. And so I began to sort of recalibrate my own feelings toward my mother at that point. And she, around that time, said, I turned on, tuned in, dropped out, but I'm finally crawling back. And that was sort of her sense that she was going to rejoin, she was going to wave the white flag. The revolution was not coming tomorrow, and she was going to rejoin American society. Now that said, when the whole Occupy movement was happening, my mother was like, oh, this could be it, like, get ready, like, oh, like, so she's still kind of, looking forward to the revolution, but, she also has like a mortgage, so it's been an interesting relationship, and my wife and I, we actually trust her. She comes and babysits we have 3 daughters, but it's like, we come back, it's like 10 at night, all the lights in the house are on, none of the girls are in bed, one of them's missing, one's watching something on the computer, who knows what, and she's like playing the maracas with the youngest, so she's still pretty free-spirited, but has really come a long way, and I think, and we still have a very close relationship, so. Yeah, so I think one of the things that surprised me when I began sort of, part of my strange arc, right, we all have our weird arcs, but my weird arc was, the thing that you're most ashamed of is going to be your defining characteristic, which is sort of, if you think about what that is in your own life, that's like a really weird thing to have happen. So that happened to me. I didn't want to ever talk about this issue that had happened to me, and there was just this thirst to have me come speak about these issues. And a big part of that has been the fact that I'm a man. And I didn't sort of realize this until I got into it, but the perception out there is that domestic violence is a women's issue, right? It's just women get in these relationships and women get battered and women do leave or don't leave and whatever. But there's this whole missing equation of like for every victim there's a perpetrator. And this identity of, well, wait a second, why is it a man's issue? So a lot of the work that I've been trying to do is to talk about, especially with young guys, is to talk about what it means to be a man and what it means to stand up for someone who's weaker than you are and not to bully them. And I think that one of the strange realizations that I've had, that the science shows, of course, is that the perpetrators, the men who are in these abusive relationships, the batterers, were themselves victims, or at least children in homes where this was happening. So there's this strange arc where these boys, like me, who you can be very sympathetic to and say, okay, well, it's not their fault, they're a child, it's not their fault, they're a child. So now it's their fault, they're now 17 and in an abusive relationship themselves. And the way that the human mind works, where these boys who are seeing what happens, part of what's going on in their head is they're thinking, well, what's wrong in this equation is not necessarily that he's beating my mother or running the house like a tyrant. What's wrong is that I'm not the alpha. I'm not the king. But someday I will be, and then it will be okay because I'll be in control. And it's about breaking that whole cycle, and it really is this generational notion. And the last thing I will say about that is, if you think the statistics are, that somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 3 women will experience this in their lifetimes, which means roughly the same number of men will be involved. And if you think about it hard enough, you can probably think either an experience that you've had, obviously, but think a neighbor, a friend, a colleague who you kind of suspect, oh yeah, this may be happening in their lives. I think the greatest mistake is to be like, well, that's a private matter, I'm not going to pry. I think we all have a sense of how far you can pry before you're sort of, committing a crime, but some kind of stalking or something. I don't want you to do that. But at the same time, that you really do need to speak up, you do need to get involved, and you will be surprised that when you do, people, I think, will react in such a way that you're really glad and happy that you did. And when you intervene, it does help to break that cycle of violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joshua.